In the world of automotive history, there are many significant cars that quite a few people know about. Obviously, everything from the Model T to the Olds Toronado, the first front-wheel drive General Motors vehicle, not the first front-wheel drive overall, to cars like the 58 Thunderbird that set off the personal luxury craze. But today we're going to talk about and celebrate a car that you may not know was truly seminal from an automotive design standpoint, and that is the 1957 Imperial that you see here. Now, the 57 Imperial, why in the world would this be such a seminal design? Well, hang on one second, and I will tell you. But first of all, let's remember the state of Chrysler in 1957 and how Chrysler designs in 1957 really were seminal for the entire industry, not just Imperial. But Chrysler came out with its so-called forward look in 1957 across its lineup, and there wasn't a bad-looking Chrysler for 1957. Perhaps my favorite is the 57 Fury, which is just an absolutely magical-looking car with these huge tail fins and the thin roof design. And also, interestingly, not all states had yet federalized the quad headlamp rule. So many states you could only have two headlights, one on either side. And in order to kind of get around that but get the same aesthetics as four headlamps, Chrysler put the turn signals inboard of the headlights and made them almost look like an auxiliary headlamp on the 57 Fury. Genius. The only thing about the 57 Fury that I think now looks a little bit awkward is the huge front bumper. It just looks like it comes from the mid-1970s when the bumper impact standards were in place. So Chrysler really had huge success in 1957 with their lineup because of the styling. Now, unfortunately, while they had success in 1957, by the late 1950s, Chrysler's reputation for quality had caught up with it, and their sales plummeted, not only because of the late 1950s recession, but they lost a considerable amount of market share because the 1957 cars were not that well built. They're the first cars to have torsion bar ride up front, and they still were body on frame in this year, but they just didn't ride great. They rusted early. They didn't have fender liners or wheelhouses in front of the wheel, and so you'd see Chryslers that often were rusting out behind the headlamp buckets. Parts would fall off of the interior trim, and it just was unfortunate because the cars were so good looking. In any case, in that environment in 1957, Imperial launched a new car, and I think it's a handsome car overall, as you can see here. And while the four-door sedan was handsome, I have to say the coupe is my favorite Imperial overall. Take a look at that frontal glass area with that wraparound windshield. Of course, you have to have the vent windows back in this time frame for your cigarettes to vent the smoke out of the cabin. Then obviously large glass on the door, large rear quarter glass, true hardtop styling. And you have so many great design elements. Take a look at that Imperial Eagle up front, who interestingly is facing to his right, the viewer's left, similar to the American Eagle on the presidential symbol as an example. And that's because if the eagle is facing right, that is a symbol of peace. And the American eagle faces right because of America's preference of peace over war. But you also have this cool grille with a texture within a texture. Here you have the quad headlamps, and I just mentioned that not all states allowed quad headlamps for 1957. So take a look at the inset, and you'll see a dual headlamp, a rare dual headlamp Imperial. That is a stock car that was sold in states that did not allow the quad headlamp still in 1957. So there are actually two variants of the front end on this car. By the way, that's not the piece of trivia that made this car so, let's say, cool and seminal. But another interesting bit of trivia is that you could get that quad headlamp variant of the Imperial or the dual headlamp variant. Of course, you have the biplane bumper, this aviation theme, very appropriate for the time frame when so much was inspired by aviation. Then, of course, out back, you have the trademark Chrysler fins that would become part of, let's say, the entire lineup for 1957. And this was Virgil Exner's, let's say, prized design cue of this particular era. And I love that roof with the C-pillar that tapers down at the bottom, the wraparound backlight, the rocket-style or jet-style exhaust that the tail lamps are kind of mimicking at the top of the tail fins there. And then you have this interesting bumper that has this oval within an oval shape, I guess, on either side. And of course, the flight sweep or so-called toilet bowl decklet on this particular Imperial. So what an awesome looking car. So this then begs the question of what in the world is so seminal about the 1957 Imperial that I am featuring it here today? Well, the 1957 Imperial, in spite of all the cool design elements that I previously mentioned, those are not the key thing that was really seminal in this car. Instead, it was the curved side glass. The 1957 Imperial is the first car, American car, to have curved side glass. And you can see it in this photo. Notice how the glass kind of curves inward toward the top. This was novel for the time frame. Until this point, cars had glass that just was perfectly vertical, and it rolled down in the door, went up, and it had no curvature to it. But for 1957, Chrysler introduced that technology on this Imperial, and then from that point forward, pretty much every car had curved side glass. And if you take a look at this particular photo, you can see it more in greater detail. You can readily, let's say, see the curved nature of the side glass here. And again, this was done for purposes of styling. The thing that this really enabled is having the roof be narrower than the midsection of the body. And so the car then gets this better looking stance because you have the roof which is narrower than the midsection. And imagine if you're looking at this car from the rear, as we just were, or the front then, it allows the body to kind of flare out at the midsection and appear wider and more planted. So this really did facilitate a number of great things from a design standpoint, not just for Chrysler, but for many other vehicles. Now, over at GM, it would take until the 1965 model year for the full-size cars to employ curved side glass. Take a look here at the top photo, which is a 1964 Impala. A good-looking vehicle in its own right, but you can see the very flat glass panes, both in the front and rear. Of course, curved windshields and backlights were employed during this time and before that, but just not the side glass. And in 1965, on the Impala, which is at the bottom, you can see the curvature to the side glass. And I think, personally, this is one of the reasons why I enjoy the 65 Impala more than the 64. They're both good-looking cars, but the 65 just has a flair all to its own that the 64 doesn't. And the 64 looks a bit like it ran into a brick wall with a very flat front. In any case, GM would employ this on an increasing number of vehicles in the 1960s and would basically end up proliferating their lineup thereafter. Now, over at the Ford Motor Company, when they decided to introduce the 1961 Continental, which is a very angular and architecturally styled car, they interestingly elected to use curved side glass. And again, you can see the curvature in this particular photo. And I think it goes well with the car. But it's amazing because the rest of the car, the bladed fenders and quarters that are very upright and distinctly pointy, are not curved really at all. And then you have the curved side glass helping out the Continental roof. Interestingly, Ford would employ curved side glass on the Continental for 1961 through 1963, and then they would switch back to the straight glass panes on the 1964 Continental. So they actually went backward and regressed in 1964. I don't know if that was for cost reasons or for styling or for what the exact reason was, but they indeed did that. But obviously, over the years, Ford then would become a company that would employ more and more curved side glass as the years would go on. I'm admittedly not quite sure which vehicles would have the most, let's say, distinct curvature to their side glass over time. Of course, there are some exotic cars that I think did have really extreme curved side glass. But in terms of mainstream American vehicles, I would have to say that, as an example, the 71 Eldorado, with the extreme amount of tumble home, in other words, how the body kind of tumbles inward toward the roof, has to have some of the most, let's say, prominently curved side glass of any car ever produced. In fact, when you open the door on the Eldorado and you can see the curved side glass, you kind of remark at how it actually goes down in the door, because you obviously have to package that, and the glass does go, in fact, all the way down in the door. But that's not an easy feat with the curvature of the side glass. It's much easier, you can imagine, if the glass is just a flat plane and has to roll up and down. But once you introduce an increased amount of curvature, that dictates in some cases that the door section has to be thicker. And maybe that's one of the reasons why the doors in that Eldorado are also so thick. And well, there you have it. The 1957 Imperial was such a trendsetter in that particular way that many cars went on to have curved side glass thereafter. And it really was a great enabler from a styling standpoint. Not quite sure what took so long, if the technology for having this curved glass just was a challenge. It probably cost more, but clearly, as I mentioned, there were wraparound windshields and rear windows before this time frame. But for whatever reason, Chrysler decided to be the pioneer, and in 1957, and only on the Imperial, did they decide to announce and employ curved side glass. What do you think? Put a comment in the comment section. Thanks again for watching.